Today we welcome Professor Andrew Weems of Mechanical Engineering. His title's already up there, 3D Printing, A Better Future, Healthcare and Sustainability Considerations. Thank you.
Thank you. So hi, I'm Andrew, as he said. What I'm going to be talking to you tonight is about 3D printing and how hopefully we can really start to leverage. I think I went away. There we go. In a couple of different spaces, really emphasizing healthcare and sustainability. What I would like to do is to really talk at you all for a few minutes to give you some ideas of basic concepts and so that we can have a good conversation from there. And then I will move into more demonstrations, either through videos that are projected, hopefully, we'll cross our fingers, or some stuff that I'm going to do up here. And while that's going on, then we can have a dialogue as people ask questions and engage that way, if that works with everybody. So the first thing that everybody needs to really consider is that 3D printing is an additive process. It's additive manufacturing, in fact, but it is an additive process. And that's really important when we talk about sustainability because we are building up the parts that we're working with. We're not having to machine them or materials like we do with conventional manufacturing. So it minimizes waste. That's an important consideration. Keep that in the back of your head. The other thing to consider with 3D printing is while a lot of people have familiarity with it, they've seen a 3D printer or they've seen a 3D printed part, we have not, as a community, done a very good job of building the materials or the devices that we need to use in healthcare. We don't have plastics, for instance, that can be used in medical devices in the clinic. What we do have are low-cost prosthetics, we have surgical guides, we have anatomical models, but we don't have implantable plastic materials that are produced through 3D printing. We've done a wonderful job of developing the hardware, the printers that we're working with, but along the way, we seem to have made ourselves a bit material stupid. And so that's something that we need to overcome. And the reason why this is so relevant to us is that we are in the age of plastics. People who have seen The Graduate, they know that they take him out by the pool and he says, I have one word for you, son, plastics. There's a great future in plastics. And that was a few years ago that movie came out, but it was as true then as it is today. It might even be more true today. Just recently, more than 50% of the parts on airplanes were being made out of plastic. They're not being made out of metal anymore. We are transitioning to plastic. And that's true in a lot of other considerations too. Food, transportation, healthcare, we're using plastics everywhere. You see straws, plastic containers, bottles, total joint replacements, lab testing equipment, packaging for medical supplies. So we can make all kinds of stuff with plastic. We're just really bad at disposing of it. People that go on hikes, go on swims, go on runs. I went on a run on Saturday. There's plastic along the side of the road. It's in creek beds. We don't do a good job of cleaning it up, of taking care of it. And part of the reason is because we have built an economy that is linear. So what we do is we start with our material in its raw form. We make a plastic, then we make a part. We use the part, we throw it out. That's been what we've been doing for years, for decades. It's worked for a long time, but unfortunately, it's starting to accumulate with some waste. What we ought to do, really, is consider how can we start to reprocess these materials? What can we do to move from this linear economy into a circular economy? And that means that we would take a resource, we would process it into a part, would use the device in some ways, and then when we got done, we would be able to repurpose it. We could recycle it into something else. We wouldn't be throwing it by the side of the road. It wouldn't wind up in the ocean. It wouldn't wind up in our creeks. We wouldn't have to deal with it. And then we wouldn't have to wait hundreds of years for it to degrade away in these environments. We could do something immediately. We could clean up what we've got, and then we wouldn't be accumulating all this trash again. So one of the major considerations, one of the major factors in plastics recycling is where we've had success and where we've had. And there are a couple of places where we've done wonderfully well with plastics recycling. Polyethylene is a great example. So 2 and 4. If people look at the bottoms of their cups, they'll see numbers and a triangle, a recycling symbol. 2 and 4, we've done really well with those. We've done really well with 1, so PET, PET, polyethylene terephthalate. We pick those up from the curbside. We can recycle them into other materials. We have a really good track record of being able to handle those types of things. Less so with polystyrene. And while I know that college kids would never be associated with polystyrene coolers or red Solo cups or things like that, they do exist. They're made from polystyrene, and they're everywhere. 10% of the plastic that was made last year was polystyrene. We make all kinds of it, and we love it. And unfortunately, it actually is one of the most environmentally conscientious plastics that we could be producing, because polystyrene foam, styrofoam, is energy efficient. The density is low enough that we can spread out what we're making to a large number of industries and applications, so it's very useful that way. We don't have to make as much waste. And so these are very positive considerations for polystyrene, but we haven't done a good job of figuring out what to do with it when we're done. And so that's essentially my spiel for tonight. Those are the main points that I want you all to think about so that we can have a discussion from here. So what I'm going to start doing from this point is hopefully show you some of the things that my research is focused on. So working with 3D printing materials, figuring out how we can handle these things in healthcare and how we can handle them in sustainability, and how these two concepts really join together. So I will first try to demo here for people that can't see, then we'll move to the video. But essentially, great ad for Starbucks. We have a polypropylene cup. We have this liquid resin. This is what we're going to 3D print with in just a little bit. Actually, this is horrible lab practice, sorry. I came prepared and everything. So we've got our 3D printing material. And I've told you, we're playing with polystyrene today. And we need to figure out, how do we take styrofoam? How do we take styrofoam and get rid of it? What can we do with this to process it, to recycle it? Well, typically, when people think about recycling, they're going to heat it up, they're going to melt it down, they're going to do something to it. It damages the plastic, and the plastic no longer becomes viable. Oh, that's the earwig. It no longer becomes useful because we've damaged it. So we need another way to process it. And this is pretty cool because with the materials that I work with, they actually will take on the polystyrene themselves. And so this is the 3D printing material that we can work with. I'm not damaging the polystyrene, I'm just moving it into another form so that we can use it better. So actually, the 3D printing resin here, the material that we're going to produce these different prototypes with, is simply taking on the polystyrene. It's reinforcing the resin, in fact, so that what I make at the end is more mechanically robust, it's more stable, it's stronger, it can serve a better purpose, different purposes, and you can keep doing this. And so it just slowly dissolves it, and it becomes part of the resin, and so we can reprocess it. And what that looks like in a slightly different form is shown here with polystyrene packing materials. Who here has, hang on, we'll see if I'm clever. I'm not. Who here has bought anything and it comes with packing peanuts? Here's a great way to get rid of them now. You can use these 3D printing materials, the materials that can be manufactured on a large scale, and you break them down. You simply dissolve them. And hopefully what people can see there is that the resin changes color just slightly, but it's dissolved away, so we don't have that waste that's going to litter the side of the road now. We don't have stuff that's accumulating in a landfill or winding up in the ocean. These are materials that we can then use to produce widgets. We can get OU logos, or we can start to make really complicated, really porous 3D structures, or a stent that'll go in your heart. And so this is what we'll hope with the discussions today, is how this can start to move in that direction. But the important thing here as well is, as I said, once we've added a little bit of the polystyrene, we can then add more. We can have it dissolve more. So this is 500 mils or so of packing peanuts. And it just goes away. Which is pretty exciting, because it means that we can have a cleaner environment and we can do the things that we need to serve the needs of the clinic, make devices that doctors need, make therapies that patients need, with no waste, or minimal waste, really.
But haven't you lost all the properties of the polystyrene in doing, when you dissolve it, how does it still be, how is it still useful to you in the dissolved state?
Because the polystyrene is still in there. Thank you. So the question is, how is the polystyrene still useful? I'm going to paraphrase. How is the polystyrene still useful in its dissolved state? Is that a fair assessment? So what's happening is that the polystyrene is being dissolved in the resin. I'm not chemically breaking it down. I'm simply transitioning it from a solid into a liquid plastic. And what that is doing is actually reinforcing the material itself. So I'll jump to the end. When you deal with this plastic without any polystyrene, it's transparent, it's flexible. That's all there is to it. When you add the polystyrene, you can reinforce it mechanically when you add enough, and so then it becomes much more rigid, much more likely to be able to serve a mechanical purpose, so you can support structures, you can make things that require reinforcement. The polystyrene actually acts as a reinforcing agent within the resin. Does that make sense? So the question is, what is the resin made from and where does it come from? I can't tell you, I'm sorry. So we're in the process of hopefully filing some IP on this. There, I think, is some very good commercial potential with the resin formulations themselves. But I will tell you that they're biologically safe. Actually, these are things that people encounter in their day-to-day lives. You could eat these materials. They are also designed in such a way that you could do the cross-linking, the printing process on a person's skin or actually inside them, so they're very biologically safe. And they're very scalable. I use very cheap components. I don't have a lot of money to throw at the research, and so this is a way to ensure that we maintain a cost-effective portion of it as well. So I apologize for dancing around the question, but that's the best I can do. So now we're going to talk about the printing process itself. So we've got our material. We've gone through, give it a minute to think. We've made our polystyrene, finish it up dissolving. And now we're going to do the 3D printing process. And so most people, when they think of the 3D printing process here, is you've got a spool of filament, and you heat it up and you extrude it out on a surface and you build it up layer by layer, but you have to have that solid filament, right? Well, this isn't quite the case, so don't think about 3D printing this way. In fact, I want you to think about it like Terminator. And what I mean by that is that in Terminator, more specifically Terminator 2, they have the vat of metal, and then the machine reaches in and it pulls out the Terminator, right? Somebody has to know this reference. Thank you, excellent. So it pulls out the Terminator. And this is just like that, except it's not a killer robot and we're working with plastic instead. What we're doing, see, it's important to consider those things. What we're doing, this is anticlimactic. Last time. Okay, it's not going to work. What we're doing is we have a platform like this. We have a tub of resin. It's like this. You can see through the bottom. It's clear, but it's going to hold liquid. We're going to take our material. We're going to add a reactive agent. So this is a photoinitiator. We're going to add a small amount of an inhibitor that's made from oranges, because again, we're focused on what's biocompatible, what can people stand to deal with that's safe. and we're going to mix it up. So it takes on a very lovely orange color. And then you can add this to your printer in just a small amount. And this will give us just a sheet, not a fully printed structure, but it will give you an idea of the process itself. So we'll let that cure for a minute. But what happens is you take your liquid, you add all your components, and then you shine light on it. And as you shine the light on it, it solidifies. But because we've gotten really good dealing with our phones and with screens, we can isolate where we're shining the light. And so you'll get segments that solidify and segments that don't. And then you build another layer, and then you build another layer. And you keep going, and you keep going, and you keep going, until you wind up with a porous structure like that, or like this, where you can actually see all the way through. It has very low density. It is hollow, but it's very complicated. You can't produce it by any other means other than 3D. And so we're using the light to drive this forward. What it allows us to do, as I said, is we can produce parts. Oops. So we've had this guy printing a little bit. So we can produce parts like an OU sign. We can get solid films. Or again, we can make that stent that's going to go in your heart. And the only way that we're able to make really complicated structures is by having the light that we're on the plastic resin. As it turns solid, that's allowing us to make that complicated structure. We couldn't make it in any other way. So that's the type of 3D printing that we're talking about. And so in this case, it means that liquid that we had is now a solid. And so you keep doing that layer by layer, building it up, and you wind up with your stent. And so this gives us different types of medical devices that we can play with. We can make porous structures that are going to be used to treat breast cancer, that after breast cancer surgery you can support the tumor bed this way. You can make stents that will go into people's hearts. Because we're able to take this combination of reinforcement with the polystyrene, and we have the materials designed, we're using things that are biocompatible, that people can tolerate. We're able to make these devices that actually will have utility in the clinic. And so what I'm showing here, other than really cool pictures, are that we're doing cell culture. We're actually putting cells on these types of structures. These porous scaffolds here, we're allowing cells to grow throughout the entire scaffold over the course of a couple of weeks, indicating that the materials are very compatible with cells, that cells are interested in growing on them, in living there, in performing natural tissue processes. And so this is very important when you start to think about a medical device that you're going to implant. And then ultimately, we can take these materials that we've got and we can break them back down. And so that's an important distinction to make between the polystyrene. You want a medical device that you could recycle. You want any type of product that you can recycle. So what we can do with these is we can slowly, you can see that they can slowly erode away. So what I've done is I've taken these little printed cubes. So we've made these cubes. We filled them with a dye, and then we immersed them in a solution just to show if they would break down. What happens is we can break them down into a liquid form, the same type of liquid form that we've worked with for the resin. We can reclaim it, and we can do the process all over again. We can either add more polystyrene, add more reinforcement, use it as a recycling process, or we can move it into another type of material, another type of device. So we can continue this process downstream by continuing to reclaim it.
So if it's had organic material cells growing on it, when you break it down, does it kill the cells?
So the question is, does the reclamation process, the recycling process, kill the cells that are on it if they've been introduced to a biological component? And exactly, they do. What happens in this process is we wind up with only the plastic part that we want. We can completely isolate that. So we remove any risk of biological contamination, whether it's simply been cells that are seated on the surface, whether it's been that it's been implanted in a person, or whether it's been sitting in a landfill and we're going to reclaim it that way. We can isolate just what we want, so there's no risk to the user. So in that case, it's to demonstrate that we can move towards a therapeutic that could be used in the clinic. So working with the stents or with the porous scaffolds ultimately paves the way to moving towards humans long term.
Is there a limit to the concentration you can dissolve in your solvent?
There is, and it is dependent on the type of material that we are using. But typically, it's 2 or 3 to 1 ratio in terms of the amount of resin that you need to the amount of polystyrene, and that's by weight. And given that these guys are not dense, you're talking about a lot of polystyrene that you can get rid of in one batch of resin.
How do the mechanical copies of the 3D printed material compare to that of the traditionally made material?
So the question is, how do the mechanical properties of the 3D printed material differ from materials that are manufactured with conventional techniques? And the answer there is a little bit complicated, but essentially the material itself is no different in terms of its mechanics, other than the fact that you can enhance it, you could reinforce it and make it stronger. But with 3D printing, you could actually design failure regions in, so like in a car where it crumples in specific locations, you could design that in. Or, on the other side, you could design a stronger part because it will displace the stresses to other locations. And so 3D printing gives you an enormous amount of flexibility for that reason. Does that answer your question?
Does any of the materials you use cause any problems like allergies and that sort of thing, or anaphylactic shock?
Not as of yet. There's no evidence of that. I'm sorry, the question was, do any of the materials demonstrate any adverse outcomes to people? So allergies, anaphylaxis, things like that. And the answer is no. The materials that I've selected to work with here, people come into contact with every day. Almost certainly everyone in this room has come into contact with at least one component here besides the polystyrene today. And so they're things that are very commonly available. There's a good deal of data demonstrating safety of these materials. The question is, how close to human testing are these? So it's device specific. Anything that is going to go towards humans is on a specific device. You don't do it on a material itself. And so there is one of the devices that's up here, the porous scaffold, that I think will get towards humans within several years. There's a company interested in commercializing the breast cancer device. And so we're working towards commercializing that, translating that out of the lab, and doing the necessary testing to ensure that it would be safe for humans. And that would involve a whole suite of biological tests, looking at things like allergens, at genetic issues, doing a whole suite of studies there before transitioning to humans, but a few years, hopefully not many. Well, that's what I have. So if you have any further questions, I would be delighted to take them. Otherwise, thank you for spending part of your evening with me. I've certainly enjoyed this.
If anyone's got any other questions they'd like to see hands rising.
Can you incorporate a biocide into your composition?
The question is, could you incorporate a biocide into the composition? Yes. Because we have such good control over the materials that we're working with, you could incorporate a variety of different things, whether it's a solid component such as a silver nanoparticle or a chemical component such as a different reactive agent that would release slowly over time.
In the beginning, you said there are no implantable 3D printed devices yet that are FDA approved, I assume. So why do you think this specifically would be more biocompatible with so many other components that have one?
So the question is, because there are no, or as I said, there are no FDA-approved implantable 3D printed devices, why do I think that this technology has a good route forward? And the answer is a little bit multifaceted, but essentially, there has not been a big push on large industry scale. So large corporations have not gone down a particular route yet because they haven't had to. There has been enough momentum, I guess, with the status quo to ensure that people have not made this transition. We've demonstrated some very promising results in a variety of different models that indicate that we could overcome that hump to get to that point. The other issue, the main issue, is that you have to generate enough money to do the testing to ensure that you can demonstrate safety. And that's an issue for any company starting out. So a lot of startups can't get over that hurdle because they can't simply generate enough capital to make that demonstration. Does that answer your question?
So to that effect, why would you make the transition to using these kinds of materials? Is it more cost effective, more likely to be successful?
So the question, I'm going to paraphrase, I think. The question essentially is, what's the point of going towards 3D printing if we've got conventional machining now? Is that a fair paraphrase? Okay. The point is multifaceted. So we could do patient-specific implants. I could make every person in here an implant that was designed specifically for their issue. That's one. The other is you can address needs that haven't been effectively met with conventional manufacturing. There are a lot of issues with the devices and the therapeutics that are out there now that people have simply let slide because big companies don't want to address the problem. They haven't seen, you see a lot of transition driven by lawsuits, by change in legislation, but there's not a lot of change otherwise. This is an opportunity to make that sort of change because there are patients that have reported issues, that they are dissatisfied with the devices that they're given, the choices that they're given, and this expands on that. And there's quite a bit of investor interest in being able to expand that portfolio. Does that answer your question? Okay.
How do the dimensional tolerances compare to your traditional methods of manufacturing?
So the question is, how do the tolerances of 3D printing compare with traditional manufacturing? It comes down to your printing method. So this printer up here has a tolerance of about 50 microns, which is somewhere on the order of a human hair or a couple of human hairs, which is pretty good. You could use that to scale up production of a medical device. The big question in terms of translational potential, though, is will your device require a specific level of quality control to be successful to pass the FDA? And that is a very device-specific question. So something like a stent, for instance, you wouldn't use this printer. You'd use one of the big printers that I have in the lab that can get down to more like 5 microns. For something that's not quite crucial, that you're not going to put in the heart, for instance, you could have a different tolerance and probably be okay. But again, it's going to be application device specific.
I'm showing my ignorance here. If you were to do stents, let's say, and a stent for me was going to be different than a stent for somebody else. Is there a basic pattern that you're starting with when you're doing the printing?
Yes. I'm sorry. So the question is there a template that we're using as we're making the device before we move it into a personalized structure? And the answer is yes. In a lot of cases, what you would do is you would have one pattern and have a couple of sizes, and you would move between those to do the patient-specific. You'd want it to fit, but you're not typically trying to do massive changes in geometry. If you have to move into somebody who has a very convoluted vessel or has a lot of irregular curvature in their coronary artery, then you would have to go back to the drawing board and make something especially for them. But in most cases, it's going to be more cost effective. You're going to be able to treat more people if you only have to make minute changes to become personalized.
How quickly can you make parts? How many can you make? And how big can you make parts?
So the question is, what are the ultimate parameters of the printer? Is that a fair paraphrase? So the different printers obviously come in a variety of different costs. Different types of 3D printing, of which there are several, will vary the tolerances that you can get, the speeds that you can get. My class knows all about this now. And ultimately, it depends on how much money you as a manufacturer want to invest into a device to see how you can change those sort of parameters. If you're working in a very personalized market, if all you're going to sell are highly personalized stents for one specific region in the heart, then you can probably dedicate a lot of money to getting very high tolerance printers that don't have to be as fast and you don't have to have high throughput. But on the other side, if you're wanting to make orthotics for the general public, you're going to take on Dr. Scholl's, you probably can sacrifice some of your tolerance to have a bank of very fast, low-cost printers that it's okay if one of them breaks, you'll take it off the shelf, you'll replace it with the next one. Does that answer your question? The question is, can you use metals as opposed to plastics? There are some 3D printers that let you use metals. What I said at the beginning is that there are no FDA-approved implantable devices made from plastics. There are a few examples where they've been made from metals, and that's because metals don't have to have a change in how they're processed in order to be utilized in clinical setting. The plastics are handled a little bit differently, and so there have been more barriers to entry for that. There are examples where people have made skull plates, where they've made vertebrae replacements or fixation devices that have gone into humans. And so it is 3D print with metals. There are becoming examples where people are 3D printing with ceramics as well, so working with clays or working with glasses or being able to make clays and glasses by the end of the process. Sorry?
Sticking with the stents, do you foresee any issues with your new flashes having issues with the new drug-eluting coatings that are out there?
So the question is, with the stents, would there be issues with this type of material and how it would compete with drug elution or the more conventional stents that are made from metal but elute drugs out as over their lifetime? And the answer to that is really no, for a couple of reasons. One is that these materials will degrade away in the body, and so they wouldn't be there long term, so you wouldn't have the same need for long-term drug elution to prevent clotting or to prevent fouling of those surfaces like you ordinarily would. But the other side is, as I attempted to show with these guys, we can load dyes, we can load drugs into these materials and then print with them. They can act as a reservoir for a drug, and so this would be compatible with that even over its much shorter lifetime.
So I know with traditional 3D printing methods, there's a lot of different printing defects you'll get. What are the advantages, or what kind of 3D printing defects you see go away with SLA?
So the question is essentially, why is SLA better than filament printing? And for a lot of reasons, filament printing is awful to try to work with. As you move up in cost, as you get better quality parts, better quality hardware, you will see the number of defects in your prints go down to begin with. But because we're working with a photopolymerization process, we're working with light. I'm not starting off with a solid and trying to melt it and then trying to get it to stick to another semi-solid piece. I'm just trying to convert the liquid into the solid with light. And that's a little bit more tolerable. It's a little bit easier to work with in some ways because we've done a remarkable job getting our phones to work. We do great things with screens. So we have a lot of precision there to begin with. The other part is the actual chemical process that's going on here. It's a chemical reaction that is driving that solidification. And because of that, you get very good integration of your layers. And so it doesn't fail in the same way that you get with the filaments. And so mechanically, SLA is a much better part as well. I said that the question was, did I say that the stents don't last long? And what I said, or what at least I meant to say, is that the stents will degrade over time. They will go away. You need a stent in your vessel for about 1 to 3 months. That is the length of time that it's needed to support the vessel as the tissue remodels, as the plaque buildup goes away, and after that, you don't need it anymore. It just is sitting there. We don't go back and get them because there's no point in a patient undertaking that risk. In fact, there are long-term complications. It's why lots of patients are on warfarin or on antithrombogen medications, because the long-term presence can be problematic. These overcome that limitation by having a time where they stay and they are mechanically robust, and then they degrade away over time. So the materials that we're working with have a degradation time ranging from 18 to 24 months. So they're well outside that window where you need that mechanical support, but they're also well within the window where you don't have to worry about long-term, very long-term issues.
So I'm curious, as a faculty member, what's it been like to have to know engineering and then to talk to the medical people, but then also to learn about all the regulatory responsibilities? I mean, you really have had to transcend a lot of areas. Tell us about that. What's it been like?
I'm not sure how to paraphrase that question. So the question is, describe the translational aspects of this work, maybe? So as you say, there's been a lot of engineering that goes into this type of design. There's also a lot of biology and medicine, and then ultimately trying to translate this towards something that people can utilize. A lot of it you pick up along the way. So I started as a grad student and worked on a project that eventually got into humans, and as I was doing that, I learned a lot of the characterization techniques, a lot of the regulatory aspects. When I started my own company, I had to educate myself on what it is that we need to be testing for, how do we regulate from that perspective, and so it slowly builds. I haven't come across something that I've just wildly forgotten yet, now that I've said that I will, but it's easy enough to refresh on those types of things, and there's always a number of people that are around you willing to support you, whether they're going to be as consultants, whether they want to be part of the team. And the FDA themselves, as scary as they are actually very interested in making sure that your devices are safe, that you're doing the things that you need to overcome the boundaries that they've set to get to the market. And so they will definitely remind you if you find something there.
Just as a follow-up, have you had any interactions with the FDA? It might be interesting if you had, just to share your experiences.
So the question is, have I interacted with the FDA? And not personally, I haven't had to go to Washington and deal with that. But two of the devices that I worked on are in humans currently. One is going for what's called a Class 2, or one is approved for sale for approval with the FDA, which requires a Class 3, so multiple in humans. It's an intensive process. Typically, your first communication is going to be 6 months out. You're going to send a letter and you're going to hear back in 6 months. And then if they tell you to do something, and they almost always tell you to do multiple somethings, you're going to have to go and do them, and you're going to do it again. It's a very iterative process, and they don't always know what it is that they want either, because people, engineers, doctors, anyone else who comes up with a device and wants to get it to the market, maybe they're solving a that somebody's tried to address. They're making an improvement on a stent, for instance, or maybe they're trying to solve something that nobody else has thought about. And so the agency doesn't always even know the types of questions that they need to ask, but they know they need to ask them. And so it can be a very long, drawn-out process to get from the benchtop. You know, we've got anatomical models and surgical guides. They don't make any implantable. They don't make anything typically that you can work with. They make them to show patients what it is that's wrong with them, or they use it for surgical planning. There are a lot of regulatory concerns with trying to print a device that would be implantable in the clinic itself. The FDA has really started to think about who has the liability for a device if it fails. Is it the person who printed it? Is it the person who owns the printer? And so those types of discussions have really slowed down some of the translation there. The other major hurdle that people are working on is the lack of good materials that we have to be implanted. I have an answer to that.
Do you have any advice for someone doing research on 3D printing?
Can you be more specific?
Just like in general, any kind of tips? Like I'm starting to dive into it, but very minimal. I don't know very much at all right now.
So the question is, what advice can I give to someone who's just starting to work in 3D printing, particularly doing research? The best advice that I think I can give is to go out and fail spectacularly as much as you can. You're going to do it. It's going to happen. Make sure that you're picking good failures. So if you're working with materials, make sure that the failures that you've got, that you've recorded, you know, your compositions, you know what it is that you're working with, and you can learn from them. Don't make sure that everything that you're working with has a goal. You're pushing towards something, but take the failures as they come. They're going to happen a lot. They're always very useful. In fact, they're sometimes much more useful than your successes because you're going to learn a lot more and build off that. Yeah.
I think we have exhausted the supply of questions, so let's thank you, Andrew.
Thank you
again.
all.